The sun had dipped low behind the Texas horizon, setting the sky ablaze with streaks of blood red and fiery orange. Sheriff Mark Cooper's horse trotted steadily along the dusty trail leading into Redford, a small town nestled against the rugged cliffs of Devil's Canyon. The air was dry and still, but Cooper's senses were razor-sharp. He knew the peace was fragile, too fragile. Ahead, the faint sound of a wagon creaking against the uneven road stirred his attention. Cooper's hand instinctively rested on the grip of his Colt revolver. This was no ordinary evening patrol. Rumors had spread through town all week. Joe Frank and his gang, the Ride-Out Boys, were back in the region, and they were hungry for trouble. Suddenly, a rustle came from the scrub on the right side of the trail. Cooper slowed his horse, peering into the shadows. His pulse quickened as a dozen masked figures burst from their hiding spots, rifles and shotguns blazing. "Ambush!" he shouted, reining his horse hard. Bullets whistled past, ripping through branches and charring the earth. The first volley missed him by inches, splintering a wooden fence post beside the trail. Cooper fired back, his revolver booming in the twilight. The shots echoed off the rocky canyon walls. His horse reared, startled by the gunfire, and Cooper wrestled the reins to keep control. The Ride-Out Boys had struck fast and without warning. Cooper urged his horse into a gallop, kicking up a cloud of dust as the gang pursued relentlessly. The narrow canyon funneled the chase, and the echoes of gunfire bounced like thunder. "Joe Frank's boys won't give up easy," Cooper muttered grimly. "Not tonight." Behind him, the gang's leader, Joe Frank himself, led the chase. His black hat was a dark silhouette against the fading light, and his eyes burned with cold fury. The sheriff's heart pounded, not just from the chase, but from the weight of the threat Joe Frank represented. The man was infamous, ruthless, cunning, and the most dangerous outlaw in Texas. His Ride-Out Boys were a pack of merciless criminals who had terrorized towns for years. Cooper's horse thundered over a rocky ridge, barely clearing a fallen log. The gang pressed closer, relentless as vultures. Cooper knew that if they caught him here, the consequences would be deadly, not just for him, but for everyone in Redford. A sharp turn in the trail brought Cooper into a narrow gorge, the walls rising steep and unforgiving on either side. The gang would have the advantage here, able to block his escape or trap him in a deadly crossfire. His eyes scanned desperately for an opening. Suddenly, a sharp crack rang out, a rifle shot. Cooper felt a sting in his left shoulder, the impact burning fiercely, but not enough to stop him. He gritted his teeth and pushed the horse harder. Ahead, the trail forked. Cooper veered left, hoping to lose some of his pursuers in the twisting path. His lungs burned with exertion, but his mind stayed sharp. He spotted a thin wooden bridge arching over a shallow creek. Taking a gamble, Cooper spurred his horse toward it. Behind him, the gang closed in. The bridge was narrow, just wide enough for one horse. If he could hold the far side, he might hold them off long enough to escape. His horse thundered onto the bridge, the wood creaking under their weight. Halfway across, another rifle shot cracked out. This time the bullet tore through the horse's flank, and the animal reared violently, nearly throwing Cooper. He clung tight, sweat stinging his eyes as the bridge swayed dangerously. The gang was on the other side now, shouting and firing wildly. With a desperate heave, Cooper urged the horse forward. They cleared the bridge, splashing into the creek beyond. The gang hesitated, unwilling to risk the unstable crossing. Cooper seized the moment, turning down a narrow side path lined with thick mesquite bushes. The chase continued, but the sheriff had shaken some of his pursuers. Still, the danger was far from over. As he slowed, heart pounding in his ears, Cooper knew the Ride-Out Boys weren't just chasing him. They were sending a message. The town of Redford was next, and Joe Frank was coming for blood. Mark Cooper wasn't born with a badge on his chest. He'd earned it through grit, scars, and a stubborn refusal to let lawlessness take root in his corner of Texas. In his early days as a deputy, he'd seen what unchecked gangs could do. Towns burned, families shattered, livelihoods stolen in the dead of night. Those memories stayed with him, turning into a quiet fire that drove every decision he made. For the past 3 years, that fire had focused on one name: Joe Frank. Joe wasn't some back-alley outlaw scraping by on petty theft. He was the kind of man who could walk into a saloon, flash a smile, and have half the room drinking with him before the other half realized they were being robbed. He had charm, but it was the cold, snake oil kind, dangerous because people wanted to believe him. Behind that charm was a ruthless streak. Joe didn't just take what he wanted, he made sure no one could take it back. And he didn't ride alone. The Ride-Out Boys were his chosen crew, a shifting band of hardened drifters, ex-cons, and guns for hire. They earned their name from the way they struck, rolling into a town at dawn, pulling off a robbery or hit, then riding out before the dust had time to settle. By the time the law organized a posse, the boys were already 3 counties away, leaving nothing but bodies and boot prints. Cooper had crossed paths with them twice before. The first time, it had been a bank job in Abilene. The gang's trail went cold after a sandstorm erased every track. The second was worse. A cattle rancher's family was slaughtered outside Laredo, and Cooper arrived only in time to find the youngest boy still alive, barely. The child's whispered description of a tall man with a black hat was all the confirmation Cooper needed. Now, with fresh reports of the Ride-Out Boys raiding supply lines and hitting stagecoaches near his jurisdiction, Cooper knew the time for chasing ghosts was over. This was going to end one way or another, with Joe Frank in shackles or in the ground. The mission wasn't just about law and order anymore. Towns along the border were living in fear, shopkeepers sleeping with rifles at their doors, mothers keeping children indoors past sundown. Bounty hunters had started circling too, each one eager for the price on Joe's head. But Cooper didn't care about the money. For him, it was about restoring peace, the kind you could feel in your bones when the streets were quiet at night. Joe Frank might have thought he was untouchable, hiding behind the loyalty of his crew and the wild stretches of Texas plains. But Cooper had patience, and he had a hunter's instinct. He'd wait, he'd track, and when the moment came, he'd be ready. The badge on his chest wasn't just metal, it was a promise. And Sheriff Mark Cooper always kept his promises. Sheriff Mark Cooper had chased criminals before, but the hunt for Joe Frank and the Ride-Out Boys wasn't just another case. This time, the stakes weren't measured only in arrests or court dates. They were measured in lives. Every day Joe and his crew remained free was another day someone in Cooper's County could end up dead. The first layer of danger was the town of Redford, a hard-working settlement about 40 miles from the border. Redford wasn't big, a single main street, a few side alleys, and a rail spur that kept it connected to the rest of Texas. The people there lived by honest work: cattle ranchers, blacksmiths, dry goods shopkeepers, and railroad laborers. But lately, fear had replaced the easy rhythm of their lives. Businesses were closing earlier, curtains were drawn before sunset, and the saloon that once rang with laughter now sat half-empty most nights. Rumors spread quickly in a small town, and every whisper of the Ride-Out Boys' whereabouts felt like a thunderclap. Joe Frank's raids weren't random. He targeted supply shipments, payroll wagons, and stagecoaches, knowing each hit would choke Redford's lifeline a little more. It wasn't just about stealing money, it was about control. If a man could make a whole town too scared to stand up to him, he didn't need to run it from behind a desk. He ran it from the saddle. And there was more than the town at stake. Cooper's own family lived on the outskirts of Redford. His younger sister, Hannah, ran the general store with her husband, Sam. Their children, Cooper's niece and nephew, played in the dusty yard just off the main road. Cooper didn't advertise that connection, but Joe Frank was cunning. And if the outlaw learned about Cooper's family, they could easily become leverage. In law enforcement, personal ties were a vulnerability, and Cooper knew Joe had no moral compass to stop him from exploiting it. There was also the bounty, $5,000, dead or alive. That was enough to draw every cutthroat bounty hunter within 100 miles. Some of these men were worse than the outlaws they hunted, willing to shoot first and ask questions later. Cooper worried that if a bounty hunter reached Joe Frank before the law did, it wouldn't end with a clean arrest. It would end with a public bloodbath, and maybe even innocent casualties. Beyond the local danger, there was the broader reputation of the county and its law enforcement. If Cooper failed to bring Joe in, it would send a dangerous message that a man like Joe Frank could operate without consequence in Texas. Lawlessness wasn't a storm that passed on its own. It spread town by town until good people either packed up and left or learned to live under the thumb of fear. Then there was the psychological toll. Cooper had seen the way fear hollowed out a community. Men who once spoke boldly about defending their homes now looked over their shoulders in the street. Women walked their children to school with eyes scanning every shadow. Even the pastor at the little white church had started locking the doors during Sunday service. That kind of fear changed people, and once it took root, it was hard to uproot. For Cooper personally, the stakes were even sharper. This wasn't just a matter of catching Joe Frank. It was about proving to himself that the badge he wore still meant something. Over the years, he'd seen sheriffs and marshals fall into corruption, taking bribes, or looking the other way when a man with enough power committed crimes. Cooper had sworn to be different, but promises had weight, and the longer Joe Frank roamed free, the heavier that weight became. Every lawman had a moment in his career that defined him, a line in the sand. This was Cooper's. Catching Joe Frank could mean restoring safety, dignity, and hope to Redford. Failing meant watching the town slip into a state of quiet surrender, its people too scared to live free. And time was not on his side. Joe Frank was bold enough to strike in daylight and smart enough to disappear into the hills before dusk. Every raid left another trail of damage, and sooner or later, one of those raids was going to leave more than property stolen. It was going to leave more bodies in the dirt. So Cooper carried the weight of an entire community on his shoulders. He knew that if he didn't stop Joe Frank soon, the ride-out boys would grow bolder, the bounty hunters would grow more reckless, and the town's faith in justice would fade for good. It wasn't just a hunt anymore. It was a race against fear, against bloodshed, and against time. And Sheriff Mark Cooper didn't intend to lose. The morning after the ambush, Sheriff Mark Cooper stood in the shade of his office porch, staring at the dusty main street. His coat hung open, revolver heavy on his hip, but his mind was elsewhere, retracing every detail of yesterday's brush with the ride-out boys. He knew that in the desert, even ghosts left traces, and Joe Frank's crew was no exception. The first step was forensics, though in 1889 Texas, that meant more than just dusting for prints. Cooper went back to the ambush site before the sun climbed too high. The ground was still scuffed from boot heels and hooves. A cluster of cigarette butts, all rolled with a distinctive brand of paper from Mexico, told him someone in Joe's crew had crossed the border recently. A spent rifle casing bore a scratch along the primer, a flaw Cooper recognized. Only one gunsmith in 3 counties sold rifles with that firing pin defect, a man named Willard Pike in Dry Creek. That gave him a lead. Back in town, Cooper turned to his informants. One was Charlie One-Eye Rollins, an old horse trader who'd been on both sides of the law. Cooper found him in the back of the saloon, nursing whiskey even though it was barely noon. Rollins didn't talk for free, but a promise to look the other way on a few stolen horses loosened his tongue. "They've been riding south," Rollins said, voice low. "Joe's got a hideout near Devil's Canyon. Ain't easy to find. You'd need someone who's been there." Cooper filed that away, but didn't press. Too much pressure, and Rollins might warn the gang. The sheriff knew that informants were like desert wells, useful but easy to run dry. The next lead came from the railroad station. A clerk reported a freight wagon hijacking 3 nights prior. The attackers had been masked, but one dropped a bandana embroidered with a faded rodeo emblem, the kind given out at the Fort Stanton rodeo years ago. Cooper remembered that Joe Frank had once competed there back when he was just another cowboy with a fast draw and a mean streak. That meant someone in the gang was still sentimental enough to carry it. Sentiment could be dangerous. It left breadcrumbs. Then came the stakeouts. Cooper spent 3 nights camped on a ridge overlooking the trail between Redford and Dry Creek, binoculars in hand. The nights were long and silent except for the wind, the kind of quiet that made every coyote howl sound like a warning. On the second night, his patience paid off. A rider approached under the cover of moonlight, leading a packhorse loaded with burlap sacks. Cooper tracked him until dawn, careful to keep his distance. The trail ended at a dry riverbed, where fresh hoof prints vanished into hard stone. Each clue painted the picture clearer. Joe's men were moving goods south, likely to trade for ammunition and supplies across the border. But the closer Cooper got, the more tension began to coil around him. Rumors spread that the gang knew the law was closing in. A shopkeeper swore she'd seen a man watching Cooper's office from the alley at night. Hannah, his sister, mentioned that a stranger had asked too many questions about the sheriff's kin. That was when Cooper felt the hunch shift from pursuit to mutual stalking. They were watching him as much as he was watching them. The final piece came from Willard Pike, the gunsmith in Dry Creek. Cooper rode out under the guise of buying rifle cartridges. Over the counter, Pike admitted selling a Winchester to a tall man in a black hat just 2 weeks prior. Paid in gold coins, no questions asked. Pike swore he didn't know the man's name, but Cooper's gut told him otherwise. When Cooper stepped out of the shop, the heat was oppressive, the streets eerily quiet. In the distance, a rider was watching from the edge of town. By the time Cooper swung into the saddle, the figure was gone. The investigation had given him a map of sorts, not on paper, but in his mind. Joe Frank's movements were tightening into a pattern, and patterns could be exploited. Still, every clue came with risk. The closer Cooper got, the more he felt the gang's presence pressing in. It was no longer a question of whether they would cross paths again. The question was who would strike first. The quiet tension that had been building around Redford finally snapped one stifling night when Cooper learned that the danger was closer than he thought, and far more personal. It started with a message delivered in the dark. A bloodied handkerchief pinned to the sheriff's office door, soaked in fresh blood and stamped with the Ride-Out Boy's signature. The number 8, written in crude red ink. It was a grim reminder. Charlie One-Eye Rollins, Cooper's most trusted informant, was dead. His throat had been cut, and his body dumped in a narrow alley behind the saloon. No one had seen who did it, but the message was unmistakable. Anyone who helped Cooper risked the same fate. The news sent shockwaves through Redford. Men who had once nodded at Cooper on the street now crossed the road to avoid him. Shopkeepers locked their doors hours earlier. Children were ushered inside before sundown, and the murmurs of fear grew louder. The town was slipping further under the shadow of Joe Frank's wrath. Cooper felt the weight of the betrayal keenly. Rollins had been more than an informant. He was a lifeline. His death was a warning, but also a challenge. The Ride-Out Boys wanted to scare Cooper into backing down. But backing down was never an option. Just 2 nights later, as Cooper rode back from a late patrol near the outskirts of town, the danger came roaring out of the darkness. A bullet ripped through the night, slamming into the post beside his head. He flinched instinctively, drawing his revolver, but the rider who fired was already melting into the shadows. More shots followed, one grazing his shoulder, the sting sharp and real. Cooper pressed his horse into a gallop, heart pounding, the sound of pursuit echoing off the hills. He barely made it back to town, adrenaline masking the pain. He knew this was no random attack. It was a deliberate message from Joe Frank himself. We're coming for you. The threat was real, immediate, and terrifying. Adding to the pressure, a telegram arrived at the sheriff's office the next morning bearing grim news. A notorious bounty hunter named Grady Kane was en route to Redford. Kane wasn't a lawman. He was a mercenary driven by the $5,000 bounty on Joe Frank's head. Unlike Cooper, Kane had no qualms about leaving bodies in his wake, and his arrival meant the coming battle could spill blood far beyond just the gang and the sheriff. The ticking clock was now unmistakable. Cooper had less than a week before Kane arrived, and Joe Frank was growing bolder by the day. The gang's raids increased in frequency and ferocity. Supply wagons were attacked with reckless abandon, and townsfolk reported strange men lurking near homes. Every day, Cooper's options narrowed. With the town's safety hanging in the balance and the bounty hunter closing in, Cooper made a decision that would change everything. He would take the fight to Joe Frank, hunting him in the labyrinthine Devil's Canyon rumored to be the gang's hideout. Cooper knew the canyon well. Narrow ravines, sharp cliffs, and natural choke points perfect for an ambush. It was a place where a misstep could mean death, but also where the terrain could be used to a lawman's advantage. Under the cover of night, Cooper rode silently into the canyon, eyes sharp for any sign of movement. The faint glow of a campfire appeared in the distance. 6 men clustered around it, laughing and passing a whiskey bottle. Cooper's breath caught in his throat when he spotted the tall figure in the black hat. Joe Frank. His heart pounded, but his training held him steady. He readied his rifle, debating whether to take the shot that could end the manhunt then and there. But the distance was too great, and a missed shot would blow his cover. Cooper eased back, choosing patience over impulse. But fate wasn't on his side. A loose rock betrayed him, tumbling noisily down the embankment. Shouts exploded as the gang scrambled for their weapons. Bullets whined past Cooper, forcing him to dive for cover. His horse spooked, tearing away down the canyon trail as Cooper scrambled after it, adrenaline surging through his veins. The chase was brutal and unforgiving. Gunfire echoed off the red rock walls, but Cooper's knowledge of the terrain gave him the edge. He slipped through a narrow pass, losing the gang and making his way back to Redford, shaken but alive. That close call shifted everything. Joe Frank knew Cooper had found them. The manhunt was no longer one-sided. Now the Rideout boys hunted the sheriff as fiercely as he hunted them. Back in town, Cooper's circle of allies shrank. Fear made friends disappear, and betrayals became a constant threat. Whispers suggested some townsfolk might be feeding information to the gang. Cooper's sister, Hannah, confided her fear that strangers were asking too many questions about her family. The line between friend and foe blurred. The clock was relentless. With the bounty hunter Kane closing in, the townspeople growing restless, and the gang emboldened, Cooper was forced to abandon careful planning. He needed to act fast and decisively. Gathering a small group of trusted men, Cooper prepared for a bold strike, knowing full well that it could be his last. As he tightened his grip on his rifle, he stared into the darkening sky. The fight was far from over. But this time, Cooper wasn't just chasing shadows. He was ready to confront the storm head-on. The night had swallowed Devil's Canyon whole, draping it in shadows so thick that even the stars seemed to hold their breath. A restless wind whispered through the jagged cliffs, carrying the faint scent of sagebrush and smoke from the distant campfire flickering at the canyon's heart. Sheriff Mark Cooper eased his horse into the thorny brush, every muscle taut with anticipation. This was the moment he'd trained for his entire career, the moment he'd been hunting for months. Cooper dismounted carefully, tying the horse behind a cluster of boulders that shielded him from view. His hands were steady as he checked the cartridges in his rifle, then slipped into the shadows. The map in his mind replayed every detail from his reconnaissance. The gang's camp was nestled in a rocky alcove, with a fire pit surrounded by 6 men. The notorious Rideout boys. Joe Frank sat apart from them, his cold eyes gleaming beneath a battered black hat. The sheriff crouched low, watching the men's movements. 2 were cleaning rifles, methodically wiping down barrels as if preparing for battle. 1 fiddled with a hunting knife, its blade catching the firelight like a silent promise. Near the fire, another man slouched with a whiskey bottle, laughter spilling from cracked lips. The horses were tethered near the canyon's mouth, guarded by a lone sentry whose gaze scanned the horizon. Cooper's finger brushed the trigger. 1 clean shot could drop the guard, cause chaos, and give him the upper hand. He took a deep breath, exhaled slowly, then squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked in the still night. The guard collapsed silently, and the horses panicked, their hooves striking stone as they reared and stampeded. The camp erupted instantly. Men scrambled for weapons, shouting orders that bounced off the canyon walls. Cooper dove behind a jagged rock as bullets tore through the air. The Rideout Boys were no strangers to violence, and now they fought like cornered wolves. Two gang members rushed toward his position, rifles raised. Cooper's rifle barked twice. Two more men hit the ground, faces frozen in shock. The sheriff rolled behind cover, ears ringing with the volley of return fire. Gunshots echoed relentlessly, ricocheting off the cliffs in a deadly symphony. Cooper's heart pounded, his breath ragged, but his aim was true. He shifted forward, firing with cold precision, picking off attackers as they moved between rocks and trees. Suddenly, a shadow detached itself in the campfire glow, tall, deliberate. Joe Frank. The outlaw's black hat cast a sinister silhouette. His revolver was drawn in a flash. Cooper ducked behind a boulder, heart hammering. He knew this was the moment Joe had been preparing for, a direct confrontation with the man who had hunted him across Texas. Gunfire tapered as the two circled, each waiting for the other to make a mistake. Joe's voice cut the tension like a knife. "Well, Sheriff, you finally found me. But this dance ends tonight." Cooper's reply was a steady aim and a slow squeeze of the trigger. Joe fired first. A bullet tore through Cooper's side, searing pain flaring, but the sheriff stood firm. Their shots rang out nearly simultaneously. Joe staggered, clutching his chest as he fell back against a log. His hat tumbled to the ground. The canyon fell silent. Cooper lowered his weapon, wincing. Blood seeped through his shirt, but he forced himself upright. Around him lay the broken bodies of the Rideout Boys, some moaning in pain, others motionless. He glanced at Joe Frank, defeated but alive. Relief washed over Cooper, but it was tinged with exhaustion. The manhunt was over, but the cost was clear. His side throbbed with every heartbeat, and his hands shook as adrenaline faded. He knelt beside Joe, the outlaw's glare still sharp despite his wounds. "This ends here, Joe," Cooper said quietly. Joe smirked faintly. "For now, Sheriff. You think this is the last you've seen of me? You're just the first step on a long road." Cooper met his gaze. "Then I'll be waiting." Sirens wailed faintly in the distance. Backup finally arriving from Redford. Cooper motioned to secure the fallen men and prepare Joe for transport. As medics approached, Cooper leaned heavily against a rock, letting the canyon's cold night settle around him. His mind drifted to the bounty hunter Grady Kane, still hours away. The man was ruthless, and the last thing Cooper wanted was a merciless shootout in his town. Tonight was a victory, but the war was far from one. Cooper pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders and scanned the rugged terrain one last time. The shadows were lengthening again, and somewhere in those shadows, new dangers waited. But for now, the sheriff allowed himself a moment of quiet triumph. He had faced the darkness and lived to see the dawn. The first pale light of dawn spilled over the quiet streets of Redford, casting long, soft shadows on the dusty sidewalks and shuttered storefronts. Sheriff Mark Cooper sat alone on the wooden porch of his office, the weight of last night's violent showdown settling deep in his bones. His side throbbed fiercely where Joe Frank's bullet had grazed him, but the pain was a small price to pay for the justice finally served. The Rideout Boys, once the most feared gang in Texas, were broken. Dead, captured, or scattered, their reign of terror was over. Cooper's worn boots rested on the weathered boards, his eyes scanning the waking town. The air felt different now, lighter, charged with a cautious hope. The people of Redford, who had lived for months under the shadow of fear, were beginning to breathe freely again. Word of the capture spread swiftly. By mid-morning, the jailhouse was crowded with bound men, their faces hardened and defeated. Joe Frank himself lay unconscious in a makeshift cell, his black hat discarded, chest bruised from the fight. Cooper knew better than to believe the outlaw's influence was truly broken. Even behind bars, Joe Frank was a man who could stir trouble, a cancer in the system that wouldn't go quietly. Still, for the first time in a long while, Redford felt safe. Shopkeepers unlocked doors with shaky hands. Children's laughter returned to the dusty playgrounds, and the local church saw more faces than it had in months. Hannah, Cooper's sister, pulled him into a tearful embrace at the general store, relief flooding her eyes. The small victories meant everything to a family that had spent too many nights fearing what might come through their door. Yet beneath the fragile peace, Cooper's heart bore a growing unease. The ambush, the murders of informants, the whispered threats, they hinted at something bigger lurking in the shadows. Joe Frank had been the face of terror, but not the root cause. The real threat was still out there. Reaching into his coat, Cooper pulled out a worn leather notebook filled with scribbled names, places, and cryptic notes gathered from late-night stakeouts and nervous informants. One name haunted him above all: the broker, a shadowy figure whispered about in saloons and back alleys, a man believed to mastermind arms deals and coordinate outlaw networks across state lines. If Joe Frank was the gang's fist, the broker was the hand that moved it. The sheriff's jaw tightened as he stared into the brightening sky. The fight was far from over. It was only just beginning. Suddenly, a lone rider appeared at the edge of town, his silhouette sharp against the rising sun. Cooper's pulse quickened. The rider pulled up silently and handed him a sealed envelope before disappearing down the dusty road. Breaking the seal, Cooper found a single chilling message. "You've stirred the hornet's nest, Sheriff. Be ready." Folding the note carefully, Cooper's eyes swept the horizon. The road ahead promised darker nights and more dangerous battles. But he was ready. The town needed him. His family depended on him. And he had made a promise. He stood tall, gripping his hat against the morning breeze, and whispered to himself, "Redford isn't done yet. Neither am I." The hunt had only just begun.